let's talk about, well, the future of this war. On Friday, it will be the first anniversary of the invasion of Ukraine by Russian forces. But how do we end this war? Well, we end it by, in my view, sending more tanks, sending the jets, giving the help to Ukraine that they need to defeat Russia and oust them entirely from their nation state. Or should we be coming to the negotiating table, forcing Ukraine to do a peace deal to end this war? Well, one man who takes a very different view from me is Peter Hitchens, columnist on the Mail on Sunday, regular here, of course, on Mike Graham's show on TalkTV. Good morning to you, Peter.
Good morning, Julia.
Thank you very much indeed for joining us. So we've got quite a bit of time to discuss this, so let's get straight to it. I want to hear from you why you think that what the West is doing right now, sending jets, sending tanks, helping with the Ukrainian war effort against Russia, why you believe that that is actually only going to escalate the war rather than bring it to a swifter end.
Okay, well, my reasons for thinking what I do are twofold. First of all, I'm a Christian, and secondly, I'm a British patriot. And I believe fundamentally that war is hell, and that every civilized person should do what he or she can to bring it to an end once it starts and to prevent it from happening before it does. As a British patriot, I'm extremely puzzled by what the interests of this country are in deepening and widening this war. Every major war of the last century began in a small and apparently restricted area, the First World War in Serbia, and then in Belgium, and spread to almost the entire planet. The Second World War in Poland, and then spread to almost the entire planet. People who never believed they would be involved in it found themselves being bombed in their homes. There's always a terrible danger in war that it will spread. And the simplest way of preventing that is to work as hard as we can to bring a just and peaceful and lasting settlement instead of this war. I do not think that pouring more weapons into the conflict as it now is going to achieve that. I think that powerful nations now have a responsibility to bring about, as I say, a just and lasting settlement. The war will end sooner or later, and there will be a settlement sooner or later. The longer it goes on, the harder that settlement will be, and probably the worse it will be for both sides, and more lives will have been lost, more homes destroyed, more happy human beings turned into refugees and corpses. I don't see any point in waiting around for that to happen when we could be working for an end to it. And I think it's the duty of people in free countries, such as we live in, to speak out for that while we can. It's astonishing to me. This is the biggest foreign policy and global event, at least since the Iraq War. It's astonishing to me how little it is debated and how only one side is really given much time or space in broadcasting and the media and anywhere else.
And I think that is a fair point, and there is certainly the case that whenever all of the political world agree on one thing, and certainly in our Westminster Parliament and in our media, as we saw with various other policies in the last few years, you should always start questioning, which is why I wanted to debate with you. I suppose this, I also consider myself a British patriot, although an atheist, and I agree with you. War is hell, no doubt at all. And we should bring about the end of this war as soon as possible. That's why I believe we should have been arming Ukraine much sooner, giving them more aid. And in fact, why I also think that I wouldn't start from here. I believe that if the West had been more serious about saying the economic sanctions will destroy your economy, Vladimir Putin, and that we will provide aid, there will be military help, and if necessary, troops being sent in, I think that alone would have prevented Vladimir Putin from his foolhardy expedition into Ukrainian mainland territory. I think if we had actually made more of our diplomatic efforts to prevent the war, we could have actually done so. I think that's a terrible failing by the West. When we did eventually galvanise ourselves, get ourselves together and actually stand up to Vladimir Putin with very strict sanctions and by sending weaponry and financial aid and obviously intelligence and the like as well, which has been crucial in this, we have seen the Ukrainians being able to fight back. But my question to you is, you say, look, we're just risking prolonging, deepening and widening this war. And of course, there is a genuine fear of World War III. Why do you think that if there is a deal, and there's no deal on the table which is going to involve Vladimir Putin saying, oh, all right, I'll just head back to Moscow, tail between my legs, we'll leave Crimea, we'll leave the Donbass, not an issue. That's not going to be acceptable to him. He's just said in his speech just now, it would be impossible to defeat Russia on the battlefield. What do you propose that the Ukrainian people should give up? Which part of their territory? Crimea, that was seized in 2014, parts of the Donbass? What should they give up to get peace? And why do you think it would be acceptable for a nation state to have to give up territory to a hostile invading force to get peace? Because which part of the UK would you give up? which part, which county, which city would you say, yep, in return for peace from an invading force, we'll give that up to a country whose army, by the way, has brutalised, raped, tortured and murdered the Ukrainian people? So tell me, which part of Ukraine should the Ukrainians give up in return for peace?
Well, you will notice that I haven't recommended that anybody should give up any land for peace. The position before 2014 was that Ukraine had its integrity and there was peace between Ukraine and Russia. It might have been a fairly bad-tempered peace from time to time, but it was one. After 2014, that all changed. And it seems to me that if we could get back to that position, then that would be the best possible outcome. And I don't believe at all that the territorial integrity of Ukraine should be destroyed or dismantled.
But that's pie in the sky, Peter.
Well,
the Putin's not. I mean, yes. That's just sort of lambs gambling and unicorns and castles in the air. Vladimir Putin could not possibly take his soldiers back out, give up Crimea, and walk away. There's no way that man's ego or indeed his future as president of Russia would survive that.
Yet that was the position before 2014. It had lasted since 1991, when, to the total astonishment of absolutely everybody, especially the Western nations, who a year before had been decrying Ukrainian nationalism, Ukraine emerged as an independent state. And from 1991 to 2014, a perfectly acceptable modus vivendi between the two countries was made possible. Part of the problem with people's understanding of this is that they view it as a kind of Lord of the Rings contest between Gandalf on one side in the shape of Volodymyr Zelensky and Sauron the Dark Lord in the shape of Vladimir Putin. It's more complicated than that and has been for a long time. There is here a major dispute, basically between a faction in the United States, which is very opposed to the revival of Russia in any form, and Russia itself. And Ukraine has been the chosen battleground. And this has resulted in all kinds of catastrophic results. In my view, the expansion of NATO beginning in the 1990s was hugely opposed by very intelligent people in the West, particularly by George Kennan, the architect of the West's Cold War victory, who said it was both stupid and wrong and dangerous, and also that it was a betrayal of the Democrats in Russia. And I'll give you another example, Yegor Gaidar, one of the sort of liberal democratic politicians in Russia, who we claim to have wanted to help, who begged his friends in the NATO countries to stop the expansion of NATO eastwards, and was just ignored completely at the time. He said it would lead to the strengthening of nationalist and ultra-nationalist positions in Moscow, which it absolutely has. I think, in my view, the expansion of NATO east was created by Vladimir Putin and his current power, and it created this enormous tension. We have to defuse it. If Ukraine is to return to its territorial integrity, which I very much favour, then we have to resolve the fact that there is a genuine worry in Moscow, not just among ultra-nationalists such as Putin, but among ordinary liberal democratic Russians about the expansion eastwards of an alliance which seems to them to be anti-Russian. And this has to be addressed.
I completely agree, because we can find ourselves in Treaty of Versailles territory in terms of an aggrieved Germany or an aggrieved Russia. We'll take a very, very quick break. Vladimir Putin is still speaking. We'll bring you some more of what he's had to say. So that Ukraine is a training ground for the West. It's one of the things he said in his speech this morning. Hartley-Brewer. We are currently talking to Peter Hitchens, columnist on the Mail on Sunday, and one of those calling for to basically get round the table, West and Putin and Ukraine, and force a peace deal to stop the escalation and the prolonging of this war, which has left tens of thousands dead, civilians and conscripts alike, and also forcing everyone to the table to stop this from escalating into, well, even Joe Biden has repeatedly said, a third world war. Peter Hitchens, you say, look, you want Ukraine's territorial integrity return, and that would involve not just the Donbass regions, which Vladimir Putin this morning has claimed were these new territories he said chose to be with Russia. You also say the return of Crimea. It's very, very clear from what Vladimir Putin has said since this invasion, and indeed for quite some time beforehand, he does not recognise Ukraine as an independent nation state. It's sort of a pretend country as far as he's concerned. It is part of Russia, not just the Soviet Union, part of Russia in his view. He is not going to accept that. Do you not think that actually it's the failure of the West to stand up to Vladimir Putin in goodness knows how many years. I mean, Georgia, Chechnya, Syria, failure of the West to get involved there. The Skripal poisonings, just we expelled a few diplomats rather than treating it as the act of war. Sending Russian agents with poison to Salisbury was an act of war, in my view. Crimea's the invasion in 2014, the lacklustre Western response. We have sent a message to Vladimir Putin that, you know what, you can get away with this stuff. Now, if we don't fight back now against him, are we not going to be, and insist that it doesn't end until he leaves all Ukrainian territory to the Ukrainian people, including Crimea and the Donbass region in the east, that actually he will just say, great, well, I've got Crimea, got a bit of the Donbass, done the peace talks, right, I move on next. Where does he move on next to? Because certainly an awful lot of states in Eastern Europe are very concerned they could be next, whether it's Poland, whether it's the Baltic states, Finland and others, previously neutral state nations saying, do you know what, we are now so fearful of Vladimir Putin's expansionist aims, he's not going to accept our neutrality, and they are joining NATO. Do you not think the message we need to send to Vladimir Putin after this invasion of Ukraine mainland territory is that enough is enough? And if we don't stop him now, then he's just going to keep on doing this, and another country will be next.
No, I think this confrontation has been wholly unnecessary and largely chosen by the United States.
But what do you mean? That America didn't choose to invade Ukraine?
I'll tell you what I mean. And it goes back to what I was discussing earlier. In the 1990s, the decision was taken against the advice of some of the most intelligent and experienced diplomats and politicians of the age that we would expand NATO eastwards. Russia at that time was not in any way threatening anybody. The Baltic states, for instance, had become independent. I was pretty much there when it happened. I was in Vilnius in 1991 when the KGB tried a small massacre to put the Lithuanians off independence and failed. And shortly after that, the Baltic states became independent. They were independent for 13 years before they became members of NATO and maintained that. The expansion of NATO created a tension which strengthened, and I'll repeat this because it's so important, strengthened the forces of virulent nationalism and stupidity in Russia, and weakened the forces which were in favor of developing that country as a free and democratic nation, which it could have been. Now, we've missed that opportunity, and now we've got to a position where we actually are involved in a major shooting war on European territory for the first time since 1945. A very dangerous war, which could at any stage, as a result of some unforeseen event or accident, expand far more widely. And it seems to me we need to reassess, particularly the United States strategy towards Russia. What has been the point of it? Russia is part geographically and politically and economically of Europe, but it's very difficult for the European Union or NATO ever to have incorporated it inside them because it would dominate by its size any one of those organizations. But some accommodation needed to be found. It was not found, and the course that's been taken since that diplomatic genius, the man who created the Iraq War, George W. Bush, said that Ukraine should join NATO at the Bucharest summit in 2008. That situation has led us to this. It's plainly gone wrong. As a strategy, the expansion of NATO and the incessant pressure on Russia by the United States has resulted in a war started by a madman, in my view, a disaster from his own country's point of view, a horrible, brutal, vicious, lawless war, which we now have in Europe, a war which might spread. We need to reconsider our strategy, which has actually brought us.
Okay, I completely accept that.
Julia, one very important point here. This isn't just me talking. The idea that that Russia was provoked in this way, which does not excuse the action of Putin, which I absolutely do not excuse. The idea that Russia was provoked is actually being put forward by Robert Kagan, one of the principal architects of the neoconservative anti-Russia.
Okay, Peter, we're running out of time, so I want to move on. But I completely understand this. I understand this, and this is a very widely held minority, but widely held minority view that this was provocation. The EU and the NATO basically say, "Come over here. The water is warm and lovely," and calling on Ukraine to move out of a sort of an independent sphere out of Russia's sphere into basically Western European sphere. But the reality is, what the Ukrainian people want to do in the democratically elected government should be their business. For the same reason I'm a Brexiteer. You know, they should be allowed to do what they want to do. They're not a part of the Soviet Union. And if they wanted to move towards the West, if they wanted the control, if they wanted to have the protection of the NATO umbrella or the trade deals with the EU, they should be entitled to do so. Now, it is fair that Vladimir Putin would view that as provocative, but just because someone this is akin to saying to an abused wife, look, you'll just anger that nasty husband of yours. He'll just beat you again. He'll just threaten you again or imprison you again if you insist on, you know, going out and seeing your friends or having a job. So don't do anything to provoke him. You're basically saying that Ukraine should just live quaking in fear in case they rile Vladimir Putin, even though he's not ruling their state. No, if you either accept it's a democratic nation state or you don't.
I deserve a turn now. I've said no such thing and believe no such thing. If you think that Ukraine should, and I absolutely believe that Ukraine should determine itself and its future, if you think that, then you have to ask yourself why it is that the West supported, excused, and did nothing to protest about the overthrow of Ukraine's democratically elected legitimate president, Viktor Yanukovych, by an armed mob in February 2014, which was really the beginning of the crisis in its current form. If Ukraine has a right to self-determination, why wasn't it allowed to keep its own elected president? And why wasn't it allowed to remove him democratically? He was never removed democratically or lawfully. It was basically a putsch, and it was a putsch which was, let's put it as mildly as we can, was sympathized with quite openly by Western powers. So if we're concerned about Ukraine's self-determination, what about that? And of course, since then, a very large part of the Ukrainian people, because the country has been more or less physically split, have been excluded from the Ukrainian democratic process altogether, and they're very important Ukrainians who deserve some consideration in this and should not be forgotten. As for the abused wife business, I keep saying Russia. I'm particularly committed to this because I was in the Soviet Union when it collapsed, and I thought it was the most wonderful thing I'd ever seen. This horrible tyranny had come to an end, and I've watched ever since the extraordinary mishandling of this by Western powers, economically, politically, diplomatically, in which they have made it almost impossible for Russia to recover and become what it could have become, that is to say, a free, democratic and prosperous country. It's nothing to do with coercive control or wife beating. It's to do with a completely misplaced Western policy towards Russia, which has long been a disaster and has now, as I say, led to this position where we actually have a shooting war in Europe, which we need to end. It'll be much easier to end it if people stop telling themselves these fairy tales about all the bad being on one side and all the good being on the other. It hasn't been like that. If we had been on the receiving end of the way in which the United States had treated Russia, if Russia had, for instance, sent in politicians to encourage the Scots to vote for independence in the last referendum, then we would understand how extraordinary.
The Russians repeatedly interfere in other nation states all the time. So does America. Not saying it's a battle between good and evil, but it is a battle between right and wrong, and it is a battle between. It is a simple matter of, I believe in the nation state. The Ukrainian people didn't want to be invaded by Russia. Now, the Russian troops might have been told that the Ukrainian people are going to welcome them with open arms and flowers and grateful hugs, but that isn't what happened, and we are seeing.
Arguing with what I'm saying. If you're concerned about the Ukrainian people, then what is your attitude towards the completely lawless and violent overthrow of their elected government?
But they've had elections since.
Yeah, but they elections involving very much less of the country than previously.
But regardless of that, that's got nothing to do with, and I know you're not, but nothing to do with justifying an invasion by a foreign dictator.
I'm not justifying an invasion.
No, I know you're not justifying it, but at the end of the day, that's what's happened, Peter. Whose side are you on? I mean, you might think I'm a warmonger, but you say you're not a Putin apologist, but the policies that you are endorsing is effectively making you a Putin apologist.
Why? I don't.
We should negotiate with him.
I mentioned Putin. I condemn him as a madman, as a source of ruin, as a sinister tyrant whose rise. By the way, I was writing about long before most people noticed it. I don't. This is absurd to call me a Putin apologist. My principal concern is, as I say, for my own country and for Christian morality. My own country, I see absolutely no benefit for Britain in the United States policy of actually bringing about more or less a conflict between Russia and the United States on European soil.
Okay, I'm going to end this. I don't believe for a moment that is what the US have been looking for. I don't think it's what the British government has been looking for. Indeed, the Ukrainian people have been looking for. Vladimir Putin wasn't looking for it. He just didn't think it would happen. Failure by our diplomacy in the West, I would say. We'll have to leave it there. I'm sure we'll come back to this another time as we're approaching, of course, first anniversary of that invasion by Vladimir Putin. But Peter Hitchens, really appreciate you joining us in that debate.